Amber Vale first met Benedict Ashford beneath the dull gold lights of a charity ballroom where neither of them wanted to be, though for entirely different reasons. Amber had attended because her father's shipping company was collapsing under hidden debt and appearances still mattered to investors who fed on illusion, while Benedict had arrived because his mother sat on the board of the foundation and expected him to smile beside politicians and aging socialites for exactly 2 hours before returning to his office tower. Amber remembered him only vaguely after that evening, a tall man in a charcoal suit who spoke little and watched too much, but Benedict remembered everything with painful precision, from the way she slipped off her heels under the table while listening to a boring speech to the impatient rhythm of her fingers tapping a champagne glass whenever someone lied to her face. He remembered how she defended a nervous waiter after a wealthy donor mocked the boy for spilling wine, and he remembered the brief second she laughed at something completely ordinary, a sound so unguarded it caught him off balance in a way business negotiations never had. They did not speak again for nearly a year, yet Benedict quietly followed every public detail of her life afterward, never obsessively enough to alarm anyone, but enough to know her father was desperate, enough to know her younger brother Theo had medical school ambitions the family could no longer afford, enough to know Amber had started selling pieces of her late mother's jewelry to keep the household afloat without telling her father. By the time the proposal arrived through lawyers instead of romance, Amber felt too exhausted to question fate. The arrangement was clear, clinical, almost cold. A 3-year marriage contract between the Ashford family and Amber Vale. Financial stabilization for her family in exchange for maintaining public appearances as Benedict's wife during a politically sensitive corporate merger. No expectation of love. No expectation of children. At the end of 3 years, both parties would separate quietly with generous compensation and no scandal. Amber signed the papers after one sleepless night and half a bottle of cheap wine, convincing herself she was making a practical sacrifice instead of burying her own future alive. Benedict signed them in silence while his lawyer explained clauses he had personally written. The wedding itself felt more like a royal merger than a marriage. Cameras flashed across the cathedral steps while strangers praised them as a beautiful couple. Amber stood beside Benedict in a dress worth more than her father's remaining savings, staring at reporters instead of her husband, unaware that Benedict had spent weeks choosing flowers based on the kinds her mother once grew in her garden after overhearing Amber mention them years ago. During the reception he kept his distance carefully, sensing her discomfort in every rigid smile. When she finally spoke honestly that evening, it was not romantic. "I need one thing from you," she said while removing diamond earrings in the mirror of their hotel suite. Benedict loosened his tie slowly. "What is it?" "Don't fall in love with me. I won't know what to do with that." He looked at her reflection for a long moment before answering softly, "You won't have to." The lie tasted bitter immediately. Their marriage settled into strange rhythms over the following months. They lived inside a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, yet moved around each other like careful tenants sharing expensive space. Amber woke early and drank coffee barefoot by the windows while reviewing financial reports for her father's company, which Benedict's corporation quietly rescued through strategic acquisitions disguised as external investments. Benedict often returned home after midnight, shoulders tense from endless meetings, sometimes finding Amber asleep on the couch surrounded by paperwork and half-finished tea. At first she treated him with polite distance, always thanking him too formally, always maintaining invisible boundaries. But Benedict never pushed. He learned instead. He discovered she hated thunderstorms but loved standing outside after rain. He learned she read detective novels when anxious and cleaned obsessively whenever she felt emotionally cornered. He noticed she avoided discussing her mother because grief still arrived too sharply. And slowly, without realizing it, Amber began depending on his quiet steadiness. One winter evening the elevator malfunctioned during a power outage, trapping them together between floors for nearly an hour. Amber initially laughed it off until the lights flickered completely dark and the confined air tightened around her chest. Benedict noticed immediately. "Hey," he said calmly from somewhere near her in the darkness. "Talk to me." "I'm fine." "You're breathing too fast." She cursed under her breath, embarrassed by the panic rising uncontrollably. "I hate small spaces." Benedict removed his jacket and guided it around her shoulders despite the darkness. "Tell me the worst date you've ever had." "What?" "Distract yourself." "That's ridiculous." Humor me. There was enough warmth in his tone to crack through her tension. She eventually muttered, "Fine. A dentist once took me to an aquarium and explained fish parasites over dinner." Benedict laughed unexpectedly, deep and genuine. "That's horrific." He brought diagrams. "Amber, that man belongs in prison." She started laughing too, startled by how quickly the fear loosened. By the time maintenance restored the elevator, she realized she had spent nearly 20 minutes leaning unconsciously against his shoulder. The awareness made her step away too quickly once the doors opened. Benedict pretended not to notice. Outside observers considered them an elegant success story. Magazines praised their sophistication. Investors trusted Benedict more after the marriage humanized his notoriously controlled public image. Yet privately their relationship remained suspended in uncertainty, because Benedict loved her too carefully while Amber avoided examining the growing comfort she felt around him. Then Celeste Laurent returned to the city. Amber first heard the name during a corporate gala when an older executive smiled knowingly at Benedict and asked, "Will your famous architect finally stay in one country long enough to settle down?" Benedict's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Celeste travels where the work is." Amber noticed the familiarity immediately. Later that night curiosity gnawed at her enough to search online. Celeste Laurent was brilliant, elegant, internationally admired, and devastatingly beautiful in the effortless way magazines adored. There were old photographs of her beside Benedict at university events years earlier, laughing together with easy intimacy. Amber surprised herself by staring too long at those photos. The next evening she asked casually over dinner, "Were you and Celeste together?" Benedict paused halfway through pouring wine. "Briefly." "How brief?" "Several months." Amber nodded as if indifferent. "You still care about her?" Benedict studied her carefully before answering. No, the certainty in his voice unsettled her more than hesitation would have. Weeks later Celeste appeared in person at a foundation fundraiser wearing silver silk and confidence sharp enough to cut glass. Amber expected jealousy to flare immediately, but instead she found herself irritated by how openly Celeste evaluated her like competition at an auction. Benedict remained courteous yet distant throughout the evening, though Amber noticed reporters circling eagerly around the possibility of old romance resurfacing. During dinner Celeste smiled across the table and asked Amber sweetly, "Does Benedict still work until 3 in the morning when stressed?" Amber froze briefly before Benedict answered flatly, "Not anymore." Celeste tilted her head. "Marriage changed you." "Some things are worth changing." The comment landed heavier than he intended. Amber looked down at her wine to avoid meeting his eyes. After the gala tension lingered between them inside the car ride home. Finally Amber said lightly, "Your ex seems impressive." Benedict stared out the window. "She likes winning." "Did she lose?" "We ended things because she loved ambition more than people." Amber smirked faintly. "That sounds dangerously judgmental coming from a billionaire." "I never claimed innocence." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw exhaustion hidden beneath his composure. For reasons she could not fully explain, she reached over and loosened his tie slightly. "You look miserable, Benedict." He turned toward her slowly, caught off guard by the intimacy of such a simple gesture. "Long day. You should sleep occasionally. Humans require it." A smile tugged briefly at his mouth. Tiny moments like that multiplied over the second year of their marriage. They developed private jokes. They cooked disastrous meals together late at night when both were too drained for formality. Benedict began canceling unnecessary business trips to spend more evenings home, though he never admitted why. Amber stopped flinching whenever he touched her casually. Sometimes they sat in silence on the balcony for hours, comfortable in ways neither expected. Yet every time emotional closeness threatened becoming undeniable, Amber instinctively retreated. Part of her still believed attachment inside a contract marriage would only end in humiliation. Benedict sensed that fear constantly and buried his own feelings deeper because forcing the truth would destroy the fragile peace they had built. Everything changed during a winter storm on the northern coast. Benedict had invited Amber to accompany him to a remote hotel where he planned final negotiations for a shipping merger. Amber initially refused until Theo convinced her she needed a break from endlessly managing family problems. The coastal town felt isolated beneath crashing gray waves and endless rain. On the second night, Benedict disappeared during the storm after receiving an urgent phone call from one of the cargo docks. Hours passed without word. Amber paced the hotel lobby, growing increasingly furious until emergency radio chatter mentioned an accident near the harbor cliffs. She drove through violent rain despite hotel staff begging her not to. By the time she reached the docks, paramedics were hauling injured workers from twisted metal wreckage after a crane collapse. Amber shoved through the chaos, searching desperately until she spotted Benedict near the edge of the pier, soaked in blood and seawater while helping stabilize an unconscious worker. Relief hit her so hard it transformed instantly into rage. "Are you insane?" she shouted above the storm. Benedict looked startled. "Amber, you vanished for 3 hours. People were trapped. And you thought running into collapsing machinery was a good idea?" He blinked at her, stunned less by the anger than by the fear beneath it. Rain streamed down her face while she gripped his coat with shaking hands. "You could have died." The words cracked painfully. For a brief second neither moved. Then Benedict cupped the back of her head instinctively and pulled her against him while sirens screamed around them. Amber did not resist. Back at the hotel, she cleaned the cut along his ribs herself after refusing medical staff assistance. Her hands trembled while pressing antiseptic against bruised skin. Benedict watched her quietly. "You're angry. Obviously. You cried." She stopped moving. "No, I didn't. Amber." She exhaled sharply and sat back. "I hate feeling helpless." Benedict reached for her wrist gently. "You weren't helpless. I drove into a storm because I thought you were dead." The confession settled heavily between them. Benedict's thumb brushed faintly against her skin before he released her. Neither slept much that night. After returning to the city, their dynamic shifted again, warmer now but more dangerous emotionally. Amber caught herself waiting for Benedict at night instead of sleeping alone. Benedict began speaking more openly about his childhood, his ruthless father, the pressure of inheriting an empire before 30. One evening he admitted quietly, "I used to think love distracted people from success." Amber smiled faintly from the kitchen counter. "And now?" He looked directly at her. "Now I think loneliness does worse damage." The intensity in his voice made her heart stumble unexpectedly. Before she could respond, his phone rang, breaking the moment. Then came the betrayal neither expected. Amber discovered it accidentally while searching for tax documents in Benedict's office. Hidden inside a locked drawer, she found an old leather notebook filled with detailed observations written over several years. At first she assumed they were business notes until she recognized international war crimes. "You're speeding," she informed him during one contraction. "Legally justified speeding. You sound emotionally unstable." "Accurate." By the time they reached the hospital, contractions were strong enough that Amber stopped joking entirely. Nurses moved quickly, guiding her through admissions while Benedict remained glued beside her, looking pale enough to concern medical staff. At one point a nurse asked him to sit down after noticing he seemed moments from fainting. "I'm fine," he insisted. Amber glanced over mid-contraction. "You're literally gray. You're in labor. And somehow coping better than you." Hours passed afterward in a strange blur of exhaustion, pain, encouragement, and Benedict hovering with almost terrifying devotion. He never left her side once. He held her hand through every contraction until his fingers went numb. He whispered encouragement against her hair during the hardest moments. He argued with nurses twice about pain management timing before Amber threatened murder if he antagonized hospital staff during childbirth. "I'm advocating," he protested weakly. "You're emotionally spiraling." Then labor became harder. Longer. Complications emerged slowly enough at first that Amber only noticed concern sharpening across the medical team's faces before anyone explained anything directly. Clara's heart rate fluctuated dangerously during contractions. Progress stalled. Tension thickened rapidly through the room. Benedict noticed immediately too. "What's wrong?" he demanded quietly after one doctor stepped aside for a hushed conversation with another physician. No one answered quickly enough. Amber felt fear rise cold and immediate inside her chest. Finally the attending doctor approached carefully. "We may need to move to an emergency cesarean." Benedict's face lost all remaining color. Amber swallowed hard. "Is she okay?" "We're monitoring closely," the doctor replied carefully, which terrified them both because cautious medical language never meant comfort. Everything accelerated after that. Nurses moved swiftly around the room preparing paperwork and equipment while rain battered the hospital windows outside. Benedict stayed beside Amber, gripping her hand so tightly she barely felt pain anymore beneath adrenaline. "Hey," he whispered urgently when she started trembling. Amber looked toward him, fear finally cracking visibly across her composure. "I'm scared." The confession nearly broke him. Benedict leaned down immediately, forehead pressed against hers despite chaos unfolding around them. "Listen to me." His voice shook but remained steady enough for her to hold on to. "You are not doing this alone." Tears slipped down Amber's face. Benedict kissed her hard once, fiercely, then rested his hand against her cheek. "You and Clara are coming back to me safely." His eyes locked onto hers completely. "Do you understand?" Amber nodded shakily. Minutes later they rushed her toward surgery while Benedict followed in protective gear, looking like a man marching directly into war. Fear wrapped around both of them brutally now, but even beneath panic one truth remained immovable between them: no matter what happened next, neither would let go first. The operating room lights burned painfully bright above them while machines beeped in steady mechanical rhythms that made everything feel unreal. Amber lay trembling beneath sterile blue sheets as doctors and nurses moved quickly around her preparing equipment, their voices calm in the way medical professionals learn to sound during emergencies. Benedict sat beside her, near her head, dressed in surgical gear, though no amount of hospital fabric could hide the terror written across his face. He kept one hand wrapped tightly around hers like the contact itself anchored him to reality. Amber had never seen him this afraid before. Not during corporate collapses. Not during scandals. Not even after her car accident. This fear reached somewhere deeper because it involved helplessness, and Benedict Ashford had spent most of his life believing helplessness equaled failure. "Hey," Amber whispered weakly when she noticed his breathing turning uneven. His eyes snapped toward her instantly. "I'm here." She squeezed his hand as best she could. "I know." Another doctor adjusted equipment nearby while the anesthesiologist spoke softly through final preparations. Benedict lowered his forehead briefly against Amber's temple. "You're doing so well," he murmured, voice rough. Amber laughed faintly despite everything. "I'm literally lying down." Still impressive. Tears gathered unexpectedly in his eyes then. He blinked hard once, visibly fighting for control. Amber's heart twisted seeing it. "Benedict." He looked at her again immediately. "If anything happens, no." The word came out sharper than intended. He swallowed hard. "Amber, no." She tightened her grip on his hand. "We are not doing goodbye speeches in an operating room." For 1 second his composure nearly shattered completely. Then he nodded once, jaw tight with emotion. "Okay." The procedure began shortly afterward, hidden from Amber's view behind sterile curtains while pressure and movement replaced sharp pain. Benedict stayed beside her every second, speaking softly near her ear through the worst moments. Random things at first. Memories. Reassurances. Fractured thoughts spoken only to keep her grounded. "You still owe me the trip to Kyoto," he whispered while doctors worked urgently nearby. "And Clara deserves to know you make terrible pancakes." Amber smiled weakly through exhaustion. "Your pancakes started a fire." 1 time. 3 times. His laugh broke halfway through because fear still lived underneath everything. Then suddenly the atmosphere in the room shifted. Doctors moved faster. Someone spoke urgently across the surgical curtain. Benedict stiffened instantly beside her. Amber felt panic rise immediately. What's happening? No one answered quickly enough. Benedict's grip tightened painfully around her hand while he looked toward the medical team with absolute terror flooding his expression. Then a sound split through the room. Sharp. Loud. Angry. A newborn cry. Everything stopped. Benedict froze completely. Amber's breath caught in her chest. The crying continued, stronger now, filling every corner of the operating room with furious little outrage at existence itself. One nurse laughed softly. That's a very healthy complaint. Tears exploded instantly down Amber's face while relief crashed through her so hard she nearly sobbed outright. Benedict stared toward the sound like someone witnessing a miracle in real time. That's her, he whispered brokenly. A nurse lifted the tiny wriggling bundle briefly into view over the curtain. Clara. Dark hair already visible. Tiny fists clenched in outrage. Alive. Benedict made a sound Amber would remember for the rest of her life, half laugh, half shattered relief, utterly overwhelmed by love. Tears streamed openly down his face now without restraint. Oh my God, he whispered. Oh my God. Amber cried harder immediately seeing him like that. Is she okay? Perfect, the doctor answered warmly. Small but perfect. Benedict covered his mouth briefly with his free hand, visibly trying and failing to process the reality in front of him. Then the nurse brought Clara closer so they could see her properly for the first time. She was impossibly tiny, wrapped in blankets, face red from screaming, eyes squeezed shut with deep personal offense at being born during a thunderstorm at 3 a.m. Amber stared at her daughter and felt the entire universe rearrange itself instantly. Hi, she whispered tearfully. Clara responded by continuing to scream at everyone equally. Benedict laughed shakily through tears. She's furious. Definitely yours, Amber whispered. The nurse carefully lowered Clara closer toward Amber's chest for a brief moment before pediatric checks. The instant Benedict looked directly at his daughter, something inside him visibly transformed forever. Amber saw it happen in real time. Every wall. Every old fear. Every instinct toward emotional distance. Gone. Replaced by pure devastating love so immediate and complete it almost hurt to witness. Benedict touched one tiny hand with trembling fingers. Clara immediately curled her fist around him instinctively. Benedict stopped breathing entirely for a second. Then tears spilled harder down his face as he whispered, voice breaking completely, "Hi, sweetheart." Amber had never loved him more than she did in that moment. Hours later, after recovery and endless medical checks and overwhelming exhaustion, dawn finally began creeping pale across the hospital windows. Rain still tapped softly outside, though the violent storm had faded into quiet drizzle now. Amber rested weak but stable in the recovery suite while Clara slept against her chest making tiny unpredictable noises that both terrified and fascinated her parents equally. Benedict sat beside the bed staring at them with such profound wonder he looked incapable of functioning normally anymore. "You should sleep," Amber murmured softly. Benedict looked genuinely confused by the suggestion. "I can't. You've been awake almost 30 hours. There's a baby." Amber smiled tiredly. "I noticed." He leaned forward slowly, eyes moving between her and Clara like he still could not believe either existed safely in front of him. "She's so small." "That's normal. What if we break her?" Amber laughed quietly. "You negotiated billion-dollar mergers under federal investigation. Those were easier." Clara stirred suddenly with a tiny frown before settling again against Amber's chest. Benedict froze immediately. Was that breathing normal? "Benedict. Just checking." Amber reached out and touched his face gently. "Come here." He moved instantly, sitting carefully beside her on the bed while she shifted Clara slightly so he could hold them both. Benedict wrapped one arm around Amber automatically while staring down at their daughter sleeping between them. For a long time nobody spoke. The room remained soft and warm and impossibly peaceful after the terror of the night before. Finally Benedict whispered quietly, "I thought I understood love before." Amber looked toward him softly. He never lifted his gaze from Clara. "I didn't." Tears burned again behind Amber's eyes. Benedict brushed one finger carefully along Clara's tiny hand. "She trusts us completely." The awe and fear in his voice intertwined together painfully. Amber rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "We'll figure it out." He looked toward her then with overwhelming tenderness. "You already made me better before she existed." His hand covered both hers and Clara's together. "Now I think she's going to remake me entirely." The next several days passed in emotional chaos. Family members arrived one by one, dissolving into tears almost immediately upon meeting Clara. Theo cried openly within seconds, then denied it aggressively. Evelyn held her granddaughter like someone cradling sacred history. Arthur attempted maintaining composure for approximately 45 seconds before Clara wrapped tiny fingers around his thumb and completely destroyed him emotionally. "Well," Theo announced while watching Arthur discreetly wipe tears, "the apocalypse truly is upon us." Arthur looked deeply offended. "She has remarkably strong grip strength." "You're crying over grip strength. Mind your business." Yet the person most transformed by Clara's arrival remained Benedict. Nurses adored him because he learned every feeding schedule and medical instruction with terrifying speed. He changed diapers with the focus of someone dismantling explosives. He barely slept because he kept checking whether Clara was breathing normally every 20 minutes. One exhausted nurse finally told Amber privately, "Your husband hovers like an emotionally traumatized guardian angel." Amber laughed softly. "Accurate." One quiet afternoon after visitors finally left, Amber woke from a brief nap and found Benedict sitting shirtless in the armchair near the window with Clara asleep against his chest. Sunlight spilled softly across both of them while the city glowed beyond the glass. Benedict looked down at his daughter with such quiet tenderness that Amber's chest physically ached watching it. She stayed silent for several moments, simply observing. Clara made a tiny sleepy noise against him. Benedict immediately smiled down at her with instinctive warmth. "Hey, tiny dictator," he whispered softly. "You terrorized your mother for 9 months." Amber finally spoke from the bed. "And you're encouraging her already." Benedict looked up immediately, face softening the second he saw Amber awake. "Sorry. Did we wake you?" "No," she smiled faintly. "You called her a dictator. She screamed at a pediatrician this morning." "A family tradition." He laughed quietly, then looked back down at Clara again, visibly overwhelmed all over again by the sight of her. "I can't stop staring at her." Amber watched him carefully. "You really love being a father already." Benedict looked genuinely startled by the statement, as though he had not consciously realized it yet. Then his expression shifted into something softer than she had ever seen before. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "I really do." Clara stirred again and opened sleepy dark eyes briefly before settling back against his chest. Benedict froze instantly like someone witnessing magic firsthand. "She looked at me." Amber laughed softly. "You're absolutely doomed." He smiled without looking away from Clara. "Completely." And as afternoon sunlight wrapped around the small hospital room, Amber realized something extraordinary. All those years Benedict spent believing love would eventually destroy him, all those years fearing attachment and vulnerability and loss, had led him here instead. To this quiet moment, holding his daughter against his heart while looking happier than any version of himself that existed before. Not broken by love. Remade by it. The first month of parenthood dismantled every illusion of control Benedict and Amber had ever possessed. Clara ruled their lives with absolute authority despite weighing less than 10 pounds. Time stopped behaving normally. Days blurred into cycles of feeding, diapers, exhaustion, and moments so heartbreakingly tender they almost erased the chaos surrounding them. The penthouse transformed completely. Business calls now occurred around nap schedules. Bottles occupied kitchen counters beside expensive wine glasses. Tiny blankets appeared draped across furniture like evidence of benevolent domestic invasion. Benedict adapted to fatherhood with terrifying intensity. He approached infant care like a man entrusted with protecting nuclear launch codes. Every cry sent him moving instantly. Every unusual noise triggered research. He downloaded 3 separate baby monitoring applications despite Clara sleeping less than 20 feet away most nights. "You need rest," Amber informed him one morning around 4 a.m. while watching him hover over Clara's bassinet with deep suspicion. Benedict looked offended. "I'm observing. You've checked whether she's breathing 7 times in 10 minutes. Newborn respiratory systems are unpredictable." Amber pulled him gently back toward bed by his shirt. "Come here, paranoid billionaire." He resisted weakly before finally collapsing beside her with visible exhaustion. Clara remained peacefully asleep. Benedict stared toward the bassinet anyway. "Do you think she's too warm?" "Benedict. I'm serious." Amber kissed his temple softly. "Sleep before I divorce you a 3rd time." Emotionally abusive. Yet despite the exhaustion, Amber loved watching him become a father more than she could explain. Benedict carried Clara constantly whenever possible, often pacing slowly through the apartment while speaking quietly to her about completely inappropriate subjects. Corporate strategy. Historical architecture. Why Theo should never be trusted with financial planning. One afternoon Amber walked into the living room to find Benedict holding Clara against his shoulder while explaining a hostile acquisition battle in soothing bedtime tones. "And then the board attempted restructuring," he murmured gently while Clara blinked sleepily against him. Amber leaned against the doorway laughing softly. "You realize she's a month old?" Benedict looked up calmly. "It's important she understands betrayal early." Clara made a tiny hiccuping sound. Benedict immediately looked devastated. "Was that gas?" She sounded uncomfortable. She hiccuped. "Should we call someone?" Amber crossed the room and took Clara carefully before Benedict suffered complete psychological collapse. "You need coffee." "I need certainty." "Impossible with infants." He sighed heavily. Cruel design flaw. Still, fatherhood changed him beautifully in ways larger than anxiety. Benedict became softer without losing strength. More patient. More openly affectionate. The old instinct to bury emotions beneath silence faded almost entirely now because Clara responded immediately to warmth and presence and honesty. One rainy afternoon Amber watched from the couch while Benedict sat on the nursery floor with Clara stretched carefully across his legs during tummy time. "You're doing excellent work," he informed their daughter solemnly while she attempted lifting her head with visible outrage. "Though your management style is aggressive." Clara responded by spitting up directly onto his shirt. Benedict stared down in betrayal. Amber burst out laughing so hard she nearly dropped her tea. "She disagrees with corporate leadership." Benedict looked deeply wounded. "I was encouraging her." "She's unionizing." Clara sneezed afterward and Benedict instantly forgot the betrayal existed. Nights proved harder. Clara hated sleeping. Not occasionally. Professionally. She seemed personally convinced nighttime represented a social opportunity rather than a biological necessity. Around week 6, Amber found herself sitting cross-legged on the nursery rug at 3 in the morning while Clara screamed with astonishing stamina despite being fed, changed, burped, and medically healthy. "I don't understand," Amber groaned tiredly while bouncing her gently. "What do you want?" Benedict appeared moments later already awake because apparently parental panic transmitted telepathically now. "What happened?" "She's furious at existence." Benedict took Clara carefully and began pacing the nursery. "Hey, sweetheart." Clara continued screaming directly into his soul. He looked at Amber helplessly. "I think she hates me." "She loved you 10 minutes ago." "That was before whatever this is." Another hour passed with no improvement. By 4:30 both parents looked emotionally destroyed. Then unexpectedly Benedict sat down in the rocking chair with Clara against his chest and began humming quietly under his breath. Amber blinked because she had never once heard Benedict Ashford hum anything in their entire relationship. Clara stopped crying almost immediately. Silence filled the nursery. Benedict looked stunned. Amber stared at him suspiciously. What was that? Benedict looked equally confused. I don't know. Clara settled sleepily against him, tiny fingers curled into his shirt. Benedict continued humming softly now while rocking her gently. Amber's chest tightened so painfully with love that tears instantly filled her eyes from exhaustion and emotion combined. You're good at this, she whispered. Benedict looked down at Clara asleep against him. I'm improvising wildly. Still. He glanced toward Amber with tired tenderness. You're the reason I know how to stay gentle when I'm overwhelmed. The honesty nearly undid her completely. Around 2 months after Clara's birth, Amber returned gradually to work. The transition proved more emotionally brutal than she anticipated. On her first morning leaving the penthouse for an executive meeting, she stood frozen beside the door staring at Clara sleeping peacefully in Benedict's arms. I can't do this, she whispered suddenly. Benedict looked up immediately. Hey! Tears gathered embarrassingly fast behind her eyes. What if she needs me? She has you. He crossed toward her slowly carrying Clara carefully between them. And she has me for exactly 90 minutes. Amber laughed shakily. I know this is irrational. No, Benedict kissed her forehead gently. It's just hard. Clara yawned dramatically between them, entirely unconcerned with maternal emotional collapse. Benedict smiled faintly. See? Ruthless professionalism already. Amber touched Clara's tiny hand before finally leaving. Then she cried halfway to the office because apparently motherhood had transformed her into a person emotionally vulnerable to breathing near baby socks. Benedict called exactly 43 minutes later. She's fine, he said immediately when Amber answered breathlessly. I wasn't panicking. You answered before the first ring ended. Amber sighed while leaning back in her office chair. How is she? Benedict's voice softened instantly. Currently attempting to eat my tie. Promising leadership qualities. He laughed quietly. Come home early if you can. Amber closed her eyes briefly just hearing the warmth in his voice. I will. Parenthood also transformed their marriage in quieter ways. Romance became less polished now, woven instead through exhaustion and partnership and tiny moments stolen between responsibilities. Midnight kisses in dark kitchens while warming bottles. Benedict brushing exhausted tears from Amber's face after difficult nights. Amber finding him asleep in the nursery chair with Clara on his chest and covering both carefully with blankets before sitting nearby just to watch them breathe. One evening after an especially brutal week of sleep deprivation, they collapsed together onto the living room couch while Clara finally slept upstairs under nurse supervision. Benedict rested his head against Amber's shoulder looking utterly exhausted. I think I forgot my own middle name yesterday. Amber laughed softly. I put cereal in the refrigerator this morning. Silence settled comfortably between them for a moment. Then Benedict spoke quietly. Are you happy? Amber looked toward him in surprise. He stared out toward the city lights beyond the windows. Not every second, obviously. We're exhausted and covered in formula constantly. A faint smile touched his mouth. But overall. Amber considered the question honestly. Motherhood terrified her sometimes. The responsibility felt enormous. Some days she missed the simplicity of their old life. Yet every morning Clara smiled sleepily at her like sunlight discovering the world for the first time, and every night Benedict reached for both of them instinctively even while half asleep. Yeah, she whispered finally. I'm really happy. Benedict closed his eyes briefly, relief and gratitude crossing his face so quickly it almost hurt to witness. Good. Amber touched his jaw gently. Are you? He looked toward her now, and the expression in his eyes carried years of history inside it. The arranged marriage. The silence. The fear. The longing he once hid so carefully. I used to think happiness would make me careless, he admitted quietly. Like loving people too much would eventually destroy my ability to survive losing them. His hand found hers automatically. Now I think maybe survival was never the goal. Amber's throat tightened. Benedict smiled faintly. Living feels better. She kissed him softly while the city glowed around them, and Clara slept peacefully upstairs, unaware of how profoundly she had already changed two people who once mistook emotional distance for strength. A few weeks later, Benedict returned briefly to Ashford Global headquarters for the first major board meeting since Clara's birth. Rumors about his transformed personality had apparently spread throughout corporate leadership because the atmosphere inside the executive conference room bordered on surreal. Halfway through the meeting, Benedict paused mid-discussion after hearing a faint noise through the speakerphone connected to home. Everyone froze. Was that the baby? One executive asked carefully. Benedict looked at the phone with immediate concern. Possibly. Lydia pinched the bridge of her nose. She sneezed. Benedict still looked troubled. It sounded congested. She sneezed, Lydia repeated. Silence. Then one elderly board member muttered quietly to another, he used to terrify governments. Benedict heard him. I still do. Less now, Lydia said flatly. Later that afternoon, Benedict returned home earlier than planned and found Amber asleep on the couch with Clara curled against her chest. Late sunlight poured softly through the windows around them. For several seconds he simply stood there silently taking in the sight. The two people he loved most in the world. Safe. Home. Real. Then Clara stirred slightly and opened sleepy eyes toward him. The instant she recognized him, her tiny face transformed into a smile so sudden and bright it physically stopped him in place. Benedict inhaled sharply, like the expression struck directly through his ribs. Amber woke moments later to find him kneeling beside the couch staring at Clara with helpless devotion while Clara kicked excitedly at his presence. What happened? She murmured sleepily. Benedict looked toward her slowly, visibly overwhelmed. She smiled at me. Amber blinked once before laughing softly. She smiles at you constantly. No, his voice cracked slightly with emotion. This one was different. Clara reached toward him with tiny hands making impatient sounds until Benedict carefully lifted her into his arms. She immediately settled against him, still smiling sleepily. Benedict closed his eyes briefly, like the moment overwhelmed language entirely. Amber watched them together while evening sunlight wrapped around the room. Then Benedict looked toward her with tears quietly gathering again despite all the weeks that had passed since Clara's birth. I didn't know people could feel this much love and survive it, he whispered. Amber smiled softly through her own tears. Turns out we can. Summer settled over the city in waves of golden heat and late sunsets, and by the time Clara reached 4 months old, the penthouse no longer resembled the carefully curated home Benedict once maintained with near military precision. It looked lived in now. Joyfully destroyed. Tiny socks appeared in impossible locations. Stuffed animals occupied executive furniture. Clara's favorite blanket somehow migrated through every room like a territorial flag. Benedict pretended to object while secretly buying increasingly ridiculous toys whenever he traveled for work. She doesn't need a hand-carved wooden elephant from Switzerland, Amber informed him after discovering the latest purchase during unpacking. Benedict looked calm. It promotes sensory development. She's chewing on the receipt. Clara indeed sat in his lap happily attempting to consume imported paperwork while Benedict watched with inappropriate pride. Parenthood developed its own strange rhythm over those months. Some days unfolded peacefully with lazy mornings and soft laughter and Clara babbling happily through breakfast while Benedict answered emails one-handed. Other days resembled controlled disasters involving explosive diapers during investor calls or Clara refusing sleep with the stubborn determination of a revolutionary leader. Yet through all of it, Amber noticed something remarkable happening to Benedict. The old tension that once lived permanently beneath his skin slowly faded. Before Clara, even happiness never fully relaxed him because he always expected loss eventually. Now he still worried constantly, but the fear no longer hollowed him out from the inside. Loving Clara anchored him too completely for that. One humid afternoon, Amber returned home early after a cancelled meeting and found Benedict lying flat on the nursery floor while Clara rolled beside him on a blanket attempting to grab his nose. "What exactly is happening here?" Amber asked carefully from the doorway. Benedict did not move. "We're bonding." Clara squealed happily and smacked him directly in the mouth with alarming force. Benedict looked offended. That felt intentional. Amber laughed softly while crossing the room. "You're on the floor. She likes floor time. You own companies." Benedict finally looked toward her with complete seriousness. "This is more important." The simple honesty of the statement tightened something deep inside her chest. Later that evening, after Clara finally fell asleep, Amber found Benedict standing alone on the balcony overlooking the city. Summer rain drifted softly through the air below, turning streets into blurred ribbons of reflected light. He held a glass of whiskey untouched in one hand while staring out across the skyline thoughtfully. Amber wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You disappeared." Benedict rested one hand over hers automatically. "Sorry. Thinking. Dangerous hobby." He smiled faintly before growing quiet again. After a moment, Amber asked softly, "What about?" Benedict leaned back slightly against her. "I realized something today." "What?" He looked down briefly at the city lights far below. "I spent most of my life trying to become someone impossible to hurt." Amber listened silently. Everything was about control. Predictability. Distance. His voice remained calm but thoughtful. "And now every important part of my life exists completely outside my control." He turned within her arms slowly until he faced her directly. "You. Clara." His eyes softened. "I've never been more vulnerable." Amber touched his face gently. "Does it scare you?" Benedict considered the question honestly. "Sometimes." Then a small smile appeared. "But not enough to make me pull away anymore." Rain moved softly through warm air around them while the city hummed below. Amber kissed him slowly, tasting whiskey and summer storms and the life they nearly missed entirely because fear once seemed safer than honesty. Around Clara's 5th month, Ashford Global hosted its annual charity gala, the same event where years earlier Amber first realized Benedict might not be as emotionally untouchable as he pretended. This year, however, everything felt entirely different. Reporters no longer chased scandal. Instead, headlines obsessed over Benedict's transformation from ruthless executive to devastatingly devoted father. Several magazines even published photographs of him carrying Clara through Central Park with expressions so openly adoring they bordered on dangerous for public reputation. Benedict hated every article. Amber framed one. "You're impossible," he informed her while glaring at the framed headline reading, "Wall Street's most terrifying CEO now sings lullabies." Correct. The gala itself unfolded elegantly inside the restored museum ballroom where chandeliers spilled gold light across polished marble floors. Amber wore dark sapphire silk that left Benedict visibly incapable of coherent conversation for several minutes after seeing her descend the staircase. "You're staring," she remarked dryly while adjusting earrings. Benedict looked personally offended by the accusation. "You're breathtaking." That wasn't denial. I'm abandoning denial. Yet despite the glamour in music and endless influential guests, both of them kept checking their phones constantly for Clara updates from home. Around 9:30 Theo approached holding champagne while Benedict stared suspiciously at the latest nanny text. "You two realize you've discussed bowel movements more tonight than global economics?" Theo observed. "She skipped her afternoon nap," Benedict replied immediately. Theo blinked. "I regret asking." Later during dinner, an older investor seated beside Amber smiled knowingly while watching Benedict glance at baby monitor notifications between conversations. "Fatherhood suits him," the woman remarked quietly. Amber followed her gaze toward Benedict across the table. He looked up at that exact moment, instinctively searching for her in the crowded room the way he always did now. The second their eyes met, his expression softened immediately. Even after all these years, after marriage and divorce and rebuilding everything from broken pieces, he still looked at her sometimes like she remained the best thing he had ever found. Yeah, Amber said softly. It really does. Midway through the evening the charity auction began. Benedict delivered a brief speech about expanding educational access programs through the Ashford Foundation, speaking with the same calm authority he always carried publicly. Yet Amber noticed subtle changes invisible to most people. He smiled more easily now. His voice carried warmth instead of calculated distance. He no longer projected invulnerability because he no longer needed to. Then, unexpectedly, Benedict paused during the speech and glanced toward Amber across the ballroom. People spend years chasing success believing achievement creates legacy, he said thoughtfully. But lately I've realized the things that truly shape us are much smaller. His expression softened faintly. A conversation. A second chance. A person choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. Silence settled gently through the ballroom. Amber felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest because she understood immediately he was not speaking only about philanthropy anymore. Benedict's gaze never left hers. Sometimes the most important thing we build isn't empire or reputation. His voice lowered slightly. It's home. The room erupted into applause moments later, but Amber barely heard it because something in the way he looked at her stole all remaining air from the ballroom entirely. Much later that night after the gala ended and Clara finally slept peacefully back home between them in bed after refusing the nursery entirely, Amber lay awake watching Benedict asleep beside their daughter. One tiny hand remained curled instinctively around his finger even in sleep. Moonlight spilled softly across both their faces. Benedict looked younger somehow when sleeping beside Clara. Less burdened by old ghosts. More human. Amber remembered the man he used to be when they first married, controlled, distant, carrying loneliness so carefully hidden she mistook it for indifference. She remembered how terrified he once seemed of needing anyone too deeply. And now here he was asleep with his daughter tucked against his chest because she refused bassinets unless touching him directly. The transformation felt almost unbelievable sometimes. Clara stirred slightly then made a tiny unhappy sound in her sleep. Benedict woke instantly despite being deeply asleep seconds earlier. What's wrong? He whispered immediately, eyes already searching her face in concern. Amber laughed quietly from the pillow beside him. Nothing. She's dreaming. Benedict relaxed only slightly while carefully smoothing tiny curls away from Clara's forehead. The tenderness in the gesture nearly destroyed Amber all over again. You know, she murmured softly into the darkness, you used to be terrifying. Benedict looked over sleepily. Used to? Now you panic if a baby sneezes aggressively. He narrowed tired eyes at her. Respiratory health matters. Amber smiled and shifted closer until her head rested against his shoulder beside Clara. I love you. Benedict's expression softened instantly even through exhaustion. Dangerous amount? Catastrophic. He kissed the top of her head gently while Clara sighed sleepily between them. Outside, summer storms rolled softly across the city skyline, warm rain moving through distant lights while inside the penthouse everything that once felt temporary had finally become permanent, the marriage rebuilt stronger than before, the love no longer hidden behind fear, and the tiny sleeping girl between them who had somehow turned survival into something much better, a life neither of them wanted to escape anymore. By the time Clara turned 6 months old, the entire Ashford family had become hopelessly obsessed with her. Theo visited almost daily under increasingly ridiculous excuses that fooled no one. Evelyn commissioned professional portraits every few weeks before she changes again, which resulted in the penthouse slowly resembling a royal gallery dedicated exclusively to one tiny tyrant with dark eyes and alarming charisma. Arthur, meanwhile, descended into complete emotional surrender. The man who once terrified boardrooms now spent hours sitting on nursery floors allowing Clara to pull at his expensive ties while he narrated stock market trends in a voice softer than anyone thought possible. You're all unstable, Amber informed them one Sunday afternoon while watching 3 generations of powerful men entertain a baby with wooden blocks like international diplomacy depended on it. Theo looked up from where Clara currently sat in his lap chewing aggressively on his watch. This child has us spiritually hostage. Correct, Benedict said calmly without looking away from Clara, stacking blocks with visible concentration. Arthur nodded once. Exceptional leadership potential. Clara immediately knocked the tower over and screamed triumphantly. Benedict looked deeply proud. Summer passed in warm, sleep-deprived happiness. Clara learned to laugh fully around 7 months old, and the first time it happened Benedict nearly cried hard enough to concern medical staff again. Amber had been filming casually while Clara sat in her highchair making serious faces at a spoon Benedict balanced dramatically on his nose. Suddenly Clara burst into wild delighted laughter so pure and surprised that the entire kitchen froze. Benedict stared at her in stunned silence while Clara laughed harder at his expression. "She's laughing," he whispered brokenly. Amber laughed too while filming both of them. "Yes, sweetheart, that's generally how babies work." Benedict looked at Clara again like she had personally invented joy. "Do it again." Clara slapped the tray with excitement and squealed. Benedict immediately balanced 2 spoons on his face like a man abandoning dignity entirely for audience approval. Later that night Amber found him replaying the video alone on the balcony, expression overwhelmed. "You're watching it again," she teased gently. Benedict looked up with slightly red eyes that made her chest ache instantly. She sounded happy. Amber sat beside him quietly. City lights glowed below while warm August wind drifted through the dark. Benedict stared down at the video once more before speaking softly. "When I was a kid, our house was always quiet." Amber listened carefully. "Not peaceful quiet," he clarified. "Careful quiet. Everyone managing tension constantly." He smiled faintly, hearing Clara's laughter again through the phone speaker. "I want her to remember noise." Something about the confession settled deep inside her chest. Amber rested her head gently against his shoulder. "She will." Then she smiled softly. "Especially if you keep balancing kitchen utensils on your face." Necessary sacrifice. Clara's first illness arrived in October and nearly destroyed Benedict psychologically. It began with a simple cold. Mild fever. Congestion. Entirely normal according to pediatricians. Yet the moment Clara became lethargic and miserable, Benedict's composure disintegrated with astonishing speed. He cancelled meetings immediately. He personally called 3 specialists despite their pediatrician repeatedly assuring them Clara was fine. At 2 a.m. Amber woke to find him sitting beside the crib watching Clara sleep with visible panic shadowing his face. "Benedict." He looked up instantly. "Her breathing sounds different." Amber crossed the nursery and listened carefully. Clara snuffled sadly in sleep before rolling slightly against blankets. "She's congested. What if it moves into her chest?" "The doctor already checked her lungs." Benedict rubbed exhausted hands over his face. "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I just hate seeing her uncomfortable." Amber's frustration softened immediately. She sat beside him quietly. "Hey." Benedict looked toward Clara again instead of answering. "I can't fix it." There it was. The real fear underneath everything. Not illness. Helplessness. Amber touched his arm gently. "You're comforting her." "That's not the same." "No," she agreed softly. "But it matters anyway." Benedict leaned forward with elbows against knees, exhaustion and worry pulling visibly at him. "When she cries like that," he swallowed hard. "It feels physical." Amber understood exactly what he meant because motherhood had carved open similar vulnerabilities inside her too. Clara whimpered softly in her sleep then settled again. Benedict immediately stood and adjusted her blanket with absurdly careful precision. Amber watched him for a long moment before speaking quietly. "You know what she's going to remember?" Benedict glanced back tiredly. "What?" "That every time she felt bad, her father showed up." Silence filled the nursery softly. Then Benedict looked back toward Clara with eyes shining slightly in the dim light. "I hope that's enough." Amber stood and wrapped both arms around him from behind. For her? She kissed gently between his shoulders. It'll be everything. Clara recovered within days, though Benedict remained emotionally scarred for approximately 2 weeks afterward. Theo found him researching infant immune systems one afternoon and physically confiscated his tablet. You need intervention. Benedict looked offended. I'm educating myself. You called the pediatrician because she sneezed twice consecutively. Pattern recognition saves lives. You're becoming impossible. Already was. Autumn settled across the city in amber leaves and colder evenings. Clara began crawling shortly before 8 months old, creating immediate catastrophe because she inherited both Amber's determination and Benedict's terrifying focus. The first time she successfully crawled across the nursery toward Benedict, he stared at her with utter astonishment. She's mobilized, he whispered like reporting military escalation. Clara reached him triumphantly and attempted climbing his leg. Benedict looked overwhelmed immediately. She chose me. Amber laughed from the doorway. She's climbing the nearest object. No, Benedict insisted softly while lifting Clara into his arms. Definitely intentional. Everything became dangerous after that. Clara crawled toward stairs, electrical outlets, fireplaces, and one unforgettable decorative sculpture worth nearly $80,000. Benedict responded by child-proofing the penthouse with such intensity it began resembling a luxury bunker. This cabinet now requires fingerprint access, Amber informed Theo dryly while demonstrating kitchen safety measures. Theo blinked slowly. Is your husband preparing for espionage or parenthood? Unclear. Yet despite the chaos, those months carried some of the happiest moments of their lives too. Sunday mornings piled together beneath blankets while Clara babbled nonsense between them. Walks through Central Park wrapped in scarves while autumn wine scattered leaves around the stroller. Evenings where Benedict read financial reports aloud dramatically because Clara apparently found his voice soothing regardless of subject matter. One rainy November night after Clara finally fell asleep, Amber found Benedict standing quietly in the nursery doorway just watching her sleep. Lamplight cast soft gold across the room while rain tapped gently against windows beyond the city skyline. You okay? Amber asked softly from behind him. Benedict nodded slowly without looking away from Clara. I was just thinking. Amber stepped beside him. Dangerous. He smiled faintly. Do you remember our first year married? Amber laughed quietly. Unfortunately. I spent so much time convincing myself distance was safer. His expression turned thoughtful. Now I can't imagine voluntarily missing any of this. Clara shifted slightly in sleep with a tiny sigh. Benedict's entire face softened instantly watching her. Amber looked at him carefully. You really changed. He glanced toward her then, eyes warm with quiet honesty. You changed me. She shook her head softly. No, her fingers slipped through his. You finally stopped fighting being loved. The truth of that settled visibly across his face. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Benedict whispered almost to himself, I wasted so many years afraid. Amber leaned gently against his shoulder. You're here now. He looked back toward Clara sleeping peacefully beneath soft blankets. Yeah. His thumb brushed slowly across Amber's knuckles. I am. Thanksgiving arrived with spectacular family chaos. The Ashford estate filled with relatives, business associates, children, dogs, and enough food to threaten structural engineering. Clara, now capable of crawling at terrifying speeds, became the uncontested center of attention immediately. Theo taught her how to bang wooden spoons against tables for percussion development. Evelyn nearly fainted when Clara grabbed mashed potatoes with both fists. Arthur allowed Clara to smear cranberry sauce across his suit while discussing market forecasts with complete seriousness. This family has lost all dignity, Amber observed while watching Clara attempt escaping beneath the dining table. Benedict calmly crawled after their daughter without hesitation. Worth it. Later that evening, after guests finally began leaving, Amber found Benedict outside alone on the snow-dusted terrace holding Clara bundled against his chest beneath blankets. Tiny flakes drifted through cold air around them while city lights shimmered below. Clara stared upward in wonder at the falling snow. Benedict looked up when Amber approached. She likes winter. She's staring at weather. Still counts. Amber smiled softly and moved beside them. For a while they stood together in silence while Clara blinked sleepily between snowflakes. Then Benedict spoke quietly without looking away from the city. Last Thanksgiving I remember sitting out here alone thinking I'd ruined my life permanently. Amber's chest tightened slightly. Benedict looked down at Clara now curled peacefully against him. I honestly thought losing you was the natural consequence of loving you too much. His voice softened. Turns out loving you built this instead. Amber leaned against him gently while snow drifted around all three of them. Clara yawned dramatically against Benedict's coat before settling deeper into warmth. Benedict smiled faintly down at her. You know, he murmured quietly, I used to think survival meant learning how not to need people. Amber touched his face softly until he looked at her again. And now? Benedict's eyes moved between her and Clara with overwhelming tenderness. Now I think survival was the smallest possible version of life. Then he kissed her slowly beneath the falling snow while their daughter slept peacefully between them and the city glowed endlessly below, no longer a battlefield to conquer, but simply the place where they found each other again after years spent mistaking fear for strength. Her own name. Every page described her. The first gala. Her habits. Her fears. Conversations she barely remembered. Even the flowers at their wedding. Her pulse turned cold as realization spread through her body. Benedict had known far more about her long before their marriage than he ever admitted. Worse still, tucked between the pages sat a copy of the original proposal correspondence revealing Benedict himself initiated the arrangement after learning about her family's financial collapse. Amber stared at the documents in disbelief. The marriage had not been coincidence or mutual convenience. He had orchestrated everything. When Benedict returned home that evening he immediately sensed something wrong from the silence. Amber stood near the windows holding the notebook with pale knuckles. How long? She asked quietly. Benedict stopped walking. Amber, how long were you in love with me before we got married? The directness of the question destroyed any remaining escape route. He closed his eyes briefly. Years. Her laugh came out sharp and disbelieving. Years? I never intended for you to find out like this. You manipulated my entire life. No, you arranged a contract marriage with a woman who didn't know you were already emotionally involved. What exactly would you call that? Benedict's composure cracked for the first time in years. I gave your family a way out without humiliating you. You gave yourself access to me. I would never force you to love me. That doesn't erase the lie. He stepped closer desperately. Amber, listen to me. Did you enjoy it? She demanded, eyes burning now. Watching me believe this was business while you played devoted husband in secret? It was never a game. Then what was it? Benedict's voice dropped low and raw. The only selfish thing I've ever done. Silence filled the penthouse afterward like smoke after an explosion. Amber left that night despite his attempts to stop her, retreating to her father's estate outside the city where old memories and open land gave her room to breathe. Benedict let her go because chasing her now would only deepen the wound. Days turned into weeks. Reporters noticed their separation quickly, feeding tabloids with speculation about affairs and divorce. Benedict buried himself in work with punishing intensity while Amber tried convincing herself anger mattered more than heartbreak. Yet beneath the betrayal lurked a more frightening truth she refused to face. Part of her pain came from realizing Benedict's love had been real all along. Theo confronted her one evening after finding her staring blankly at untouched dinner. You miss him, he said bluntly. Amber scowled. He manipulated me. Maybe. But did he ever hurt you? That's not the point. Then what is? She stood abruptly and walked onto the porch, frustrated tears threatening again. Theo followed more carefully this time. You know what Dad said after the company recovered? Amber crossed her arms. I don't care. He said Benedict protected our family more fiercely than blood relatives would have. She looked away toward the dark fields. Theo continued softly, people can love badly and still love honestly. The words haunted her for days. Meanwhile, Benedict faced pressures of his own. Celeste approached him during a corporate conference abroad and found him drinking alone after midnight. You look terrible, she observed. Benedict gave a humorless smile. Thank you. She sat across from him. You finally told her? She found out. And? She left. Celeste studied him for a long moment before sighing softly. You know what your problem is? Several therapists have tried explaining. You love people like they're disasters you need to contain. Not like partners. Benedict stared at his untouched whiskey. I was afraid if I told her the truth, she'd reject the marriage before it began. Probably. That's supposed to help? No, Celeste said honestly. But pretending your fear was noble won't save you either. Months passed. The expiration date of their 3-year contract approached quietly, heavily. Lawyers requested meetings regarding asset division and formal separation procedures. Amber attended one session alone and felt unexpectedly sick hearing strangers discuss the end of her marriage in sterile legal language. Mrs. Ashford will retain ownership of the coastal property, one attorney explained mechanically. Amber interrupted suddenly. Stop calling me that. The room fell silent. She left halfway through the meeting. That same week, Benedict's father suffered a severe stroke during a board dispute. Despite years of emotional distance, Benedict took charge of family affairs immediately while suppressing visible strain. Amber heard about the hospitalization through news reports and spent hours debating whether to visit before finally arriving late at night when most visitors had gone. She found Benedict alone in a dim hospital corridor, tie loosened, exhaustion carved deeply across his face. He looked genuinely startled to see her. Neither spoke at first. Then Benedict said quietly, You didn't have to come. Amber sat beside him slowly. I know. He rubbed both hands over his face. He spent my entire childhood teaching me weakness ruins men. And now? Benedict laughed bitterly. Now he can't even lift his own hand. Amber watched him carefully before asking, Are you afraid? The honesty of the question nearly broke him. After a long silence he admitted, yes. She reached for his hand instinctively. This time he held on tightly. Hours later, while dawnlight crept through hospital windows, Benedict finally spoke again without looking at her. I loved you before I understood what to do with it. Amber stayed silent. I kept thinking if I could build enough stability around you, eventually you'd choose to stay on your own. His voice roughened slightly. But love built on hidden things eventually collapses. She swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me after we got married? Because every month you stayed started feeling precious enough to ruin me if you left. Amber closed her eyes briefly at the naked vulnerability in his tone. For the first time she fully understood the depth of loneliness Benedict had carried for years beneath all his control. Yet understanding him did not instantly erase the damage between them. When the contract officially expired 2 weeks later, they met in their lawyer's office one final time. Papers sat neatly arranged across polished wood. The attorney explained terms while avoiding eye contact with the palpable tension in the room. Benedict signed first with steady hands. Amber stared at the final page for a very long time before asking quietly, If I sign this, will you let me go completely? Benedict answered after a painful pause. If that's what you want. She searched his face for manipulation, pressure, hidden strategy. For once she found none. Only exhaustion and genuine heartbreak. Her chest tightened painfully. She signed the papers anyway. As they stood to leave, Benedict stopped beside her. There's one thing I never lied about, he said softly. Every moment with you mattered to me. Then he walked away before she could answer. Amber returned to the penthouse days later only to collect remaining belongings, expecting emptiness. Instead she discovered the apartment transformed by absence. Benedict had moved out entirely, leaving behind silence so complete it unsettled her immediately. While packing books from the study, she noticed one final envelope resting alone on the desk. Inside sat no dramatic confession, no plea for reconciliation, only documents transferring ownership of the restored Vale Shipping Company fully into her name with zero hidden conditions. Attached was a handwritten note in Benedict's precise script. I wanted at least one part of your life untouched by obligation. Amber stared at the note until tears blurred the ink completely. Their second engagement spread across the media before sunrise because apparently nothing involving the Ashfords could remain private for more than 6 consecutive minutes, but for once neither Benedict nor Amber cared very much. The world could speculate all it wanted. The truth no longer felt fragile enough to hide. Benedict still looked faintly stunned for days afterward whenever he noticed the ring on Amber's hand, as though some irrational part of him expected to wake up and discover the entire reconciliation had been wishful thinking brought on by sleep deprivation and emotional collapse. Amber caught him staring more than once. One morning she looked up from reading shipping reports and found him openly watching her across the breakfast table with unreadable intensity. You're doing it again, she said. Benedict blinked. Doing what? Looking at me like I'm a suspiciously convincing hallucination. He considered that carefully before answering. I did spend years assuming loving you openly would ruin my life. Amber smirked faintly. And now? Benedict leaned back in his chair. Now my life's ruined for completely different reasons. She threw a napkin at him while laughing. Despite the lighter rhythm settling into their days, the corporate investigation still dragged on in the background like distant thunder refusing to disappear entirely. Several senior executives accepted plea agreements. Shareholder lawsuits multiplied. Financial networks continued dissecting every Ashford decision nightly. Benedict remained deeply involved in restructuring the company, but something fundamental had changed in how he carried the burden. Amber noticed it first during board meetings. Before, Benedict controlled rooms through intimidation sharpened by exhaustion. Now he seemed calmer, almost more dangerous because he no longer operated purely from survival instinct. He delegated more. He listened longer. He even occasionally admitted uncertainty without viewing it as weakness. The board barely knew how to process it. One afternoon Amber sat quietly in the back of a strategy meeting while executives debated restructuring international freight divisions. A senior director kept aggressively challenging every proposed reform until Benedict finally interrupted with surprising patience. Martin, he said evenly, you've repeated the same concern 4 times. The man stiffened. Because no one's answering it properly. Benedict folded his hands calmly. No. Because you dislike losing control over decisions you previously made alone. The room went silent instantly. Yet unlike old Benedict, he did not continue the attack. Instead he added, which I understand. But we're rebuilding a company, not protecting individual egos. Martin looked almost disoriented by the lack of humiliation. Afterward Lydia cornered Amber near the elevators looking deeply unsettled. He's emotionally stable now, she whispered like someone describing a natural disaster. Amber laughed softly. Terrifying, I know. No, seriously. Yesterday he thanked someone for disagreeing with him. Lydia crossed herself dramatically. We may all die. Yet beneath the humor Amber sensed genuine relief throughout the company. Employees no longer walked around Benedict like frightened prey anticipating explosions. Tension slowly eased floor by floor. Even Arthur Ashford grudgingly admitted during one dinner, morale metrics improved substantially since you stopped behaving like a sleep-deprived executioner. Benedict looked offended. That description feels exaggerated. Arthur sipped wine. Does it? Evelyn hid a smile behind her glass while Amber nearly choked laughing. Family dinners at the Ashford estate became another unexpected evolution altogether. After Evelyn's health scare, something subtle shifted between everyone. Defenses loosened. Arthur still remained intimidating and emotionally constipated most of the time, but he began making actual efforts that would have seemed impossible months earlier. He asked Theo about medical school without turning the conversation into a lecture. He complimented Amber's leadership at the shipping company without sounding transactional. Once, horrifyingly, he even apologized after interrupting Evelyn during dinner. The entire table went silent for almost 10 seconds afterward. Theo finally whispered, "Should we call an ambulance?" Evelyn laughed so hard she nearly spilled wine. Watching the Ashfords' attempt emotional growth felt vaguely like observing wolves learn indoor manners, awkward and slightly dangerous but strangely sincere underneath. One evening after dinner, Arthur stopped Benedict near the library while the others moved toward dessert. Amber noticed immediately from across the hall because Benedict's posture shifted into wary attention. Arthur held 2 glasses of whiskey but looked uncomfortable in a way she had never seen before. "Walk with me," he said gruffly. Benedict followed him toward the study with visible suspicion. Amber pretended not to watch while absolutely watching. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Benedict finally returned looking deeply unsettled. Amber found him alone on the back terrace afterward, staring into the gardens. "What happened?" she asked carefully. Benedict exhaled slowly. "My father apologized." Amber blinked. "Properly?" "Disturbingly properly." He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "He said he spent most of my childhood mistaking fear for respect." The vulnerability in Benedict's voice tightened her chest immediately. "How do you feel?" He gave a faint, conflicted laugh. "Honestly? Angry. Relieved. Suspicious. All reasonable." Benedict looked toward the dark gardens. "Part of me keeps thinking if he can suddenly admit these things now, then maybe we wasted years pretending none of us needed each other." Amber stepped closer and rested against his side. "Families do that sometimes." He leaned his head lightly against hers. "I don't want our future to look like that." "It won't." Benedict looked at her quietly. "How are you so sure?" Amber smiled softly. "Because we already survived the worst part. The pretending." Their wedding planning began 2 months later and immediately became a battlefield between Evelyn's aristocratic perfectionism and Amber's desire to avoid turning the event into a televised monarchy. Benedict wisely attempted neutrality for approximately 11 minutes before both women threatened him simultaneously. "I don't care about flower politics," he informed them during one catastrophic planning session. Evelyn looked appalled. "It's not politics. It's atmosphere." Amber crossed her arms. "Last week you rejected roses because they felt emotionally dishonest." "They did." Benedict slowly stood from the table. "I suddenly understand why people elope." Despite the chaos, there was joy woven through the preparation now that had never existed during their first wedding. The original ceremony had been expensive theater. This one felt personal. Intentional. They chose a smaller venue overlooking the coastline where the harbor storm once nearly changed everything forever. Amber selected her own dress without media consultants hovering nearby. Benedict personally designed portions of the reception gardens because apparently his hidden artistic tendencies had evolved into full architectural interference. One night Amber found him sketching seating layouts at 2 a.m. with terrifying concentration. "You run an international corporation," she reminded him. "Yet centerpieces consume your soul." Benedict didn't look up. "Your cousin Claudia cannot sit near my uncle Richard or someone will eventually commit tax fraud out of spite." She laughed and climbed into his lap despite the paperwork surrounding him. Benedict immediately abandoned all seating logistics to wrap his arms around her instead. "You're distracting me," he murmured against her neck. "Good." He kissed her slowly, softer now than the desperate intensity they once carried. Their relationship had changed over the past months in ways neither fully expected. Passion remained, certainly, but beneath it grew something steadier and more intimate. Trust. Ease. Benedict no longer watched every emotional shift waiting for abandonment. Amber no longer guarded herself against needing him too deeply. They still argued occasionally because two stubborn people learning vulnerability did not magically become perfect overnight. One memorable fight erupted over Benedict canceling a medical appointment for the third time due to work. "You cannot preach emotional growth while actively attempting organ failure," Amber snapped from the kitchen doorway. Benedict loosened his tie defensively. It was rescheduled. To when? The apocalypse? There was an emergency meeting. There is always an emergency meeting. Benedict's jaw tightened. Thousands of employees depend on me. Amber stepped closer immediately. And I depend on you staying alive. The anger drained from his face almost instantly at that. Silence filled the kitchen. Benedict looked away first. "I'm trying," he admitted quietly. Amber softened despite lingering frustration. "I know." He crossed toward her slowly. "I spent so many years believing rest made people replaceable." His voice carried traces of old wounds again. "Sometimes I still don't know how to stop." Amber touched his face gently. "Then let me help you." Benedict closed his eyes briefly against her hand. "You already are." Their honeymoon plans remained non-existent because neither trusted reality enough to believe uninterrupted happiness might actually occur. So naturally disaster arrived 3 weeks before the wedding. Amber was leaving a late meeting at the shipping offices when a black SUV ran a red light and slammed directly into the driver's side of her car hard enough to spin it halfway across the intersection. Metal screamed. Glass exploded inward. For one horrifying instant the world became pure noise and impact. When everything finally stopped moving, Amber tasted blood immediately and realized the airbag had barely deployed properly. Pain shot sharply through her shoulder. Outside, distant shouting blurred together while rain poured across shattered windows. Then darkness swallowed everything. Benedict was in the middle of a board presentation when Lydia entered the room pale as death. He saw her expression and knew instantly something catastrophic had happened before she spoke a single word. "There's been an accident." The next hour disappeared almost entirely from his memory afterward. He remembered driving far too fast through rain. He remembered threatening someone on the phone without understanding half the words leaving his mouth. He remembered arriving at the emergency department and physically grabbing the first doctor who tried delaying information. "Where is she?" he demanded with terrifying calm. "Sir, you need to where?" The doctor finally answered quickly. "She's alive." Relief hit so violently Benedict nearly lost balance outright. "Multiple fractures. Concussion. Surgery may be necessary for the shoulder, but she's stable. Alive." The word repeated through his head uselessly while fear kept clawing anyway because stable did not mean safe and he had already spent too much of his life losing things unexpectedly. When they finally allowed him into recovery hours later, Amber looked painfully small against hospital sheets, bruising already darkening along her temple while monitors beeped steadily nearby. Benedict stood frozen at the doorway for several seconds before moving closer. He touched her hand so carefully it almost hurt to witness. Amber stirred slightly beneath sedation. "Hey," he whispered immediately. Her eyes opened only halfway. "You look awful." Benedict let out a strangled sound somewhere between a laugh and a collapse. "That's your first observation?" Consistent branding. Tears burned suddenly behind his eyes hard enough to shock him. He lowered his head against her hand briefly, shoulders tightening once before control returned. Amber noticed anyway despite medication haze. "Benedict? I'm here." "You're shaking." He swallowed hard. "You scared me." The naked honesty in his voice cut through every remaining wall between them. Amber squeezed his fingers weakly. "I'm okay." Benedict looked at her bruised face and whispered with painful intensity, "You're not allowed to say that from hospital beds anymore." She smiled faintly despite obvious pain. "Bossy." He laughed shakily then pressed a kiss against her forehead. Later investigators determined the accident was not intentional, merely a drunk driver losing control during heavy rain, but Benedict still spent the next 72 hours barely leaving the hospital. He worked remotely from uncomfortable chairs beside her bed. He argued with nurses about pain medication schedules. He nearly had a cardiac event himself when Amber tried standing unassisted too early and almost collapsed. "I can walk," she protested stubbornly. Benedict caught her immediately around the waist. "You absolutely cannot. You're overreacting. You currently resemble a Victorian ghost. Rude. Sit down before I physically carry you." Theo watched one of these arguments from the doorway before muttering toward Lydia, "He's one minor inconvenience away from wrapping her in bubble wrap permanently." Yet beneath the humor, everyone noticed something profound in Benedict during those days. Fear stripped away the last remnants of emotional distance he still carried instinctively. He stopped pretending composure mattered more than attachment. One quiet night after visiting hours ended, Amber woke to find him sitting beside the bed staring at her with exhausted eyes. "You should sleep," she murmured. Benedict shook his head slightly. "I keep replaying the phone call." Amber studied him carefully. "Hey." He looked toward her immediately. "I'm still here." His expression tightened painfully. "I know. That's the problem." She frowned softly. Benedict rubbed both hands over his face. "When Lydia told me there'd been an accident, I thought for 1 minute that I was too late." His voice roughened. "And I realized I never learned how to survive losing you." Amber's chest ached hearing the confession. She shifted carefully despite pain and held out her hand. Benedict took it instantly. "You won't have to," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment before quietly admitting, "I still don't know how people survive loving someone this much." Amber smiled faintly through exhaustion. "Probably badly." A breathless laugh escaped him then. Benedict leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against her hand while hospital lights glowed softly around them. Outside rain tapped steadily against dark windows again, but this time neither of them feared the storm quite as much because they had already learned something harder than surviving pain. They had learned how to stay. Amber's recovery forced both of them into a pace of life neither had ever truly practiced before. Stillness. Real stillness, not the artificial kind created by exhaustion or emotional shutdown, but days shaped around healing instead of crisis. Her shoulder surgery went well, though doctors warned the rehabilitation process would be slow and deeply frustrating for someone as stubbornly independent as she was. Benedict took that warning as if receiving military instructions. Within 48 hours he had reorganized entire sections of his schedule, converted the penthouse guest room into a temporary recovery suite despite Amber insisting she could walk 20 feet to their actual bedroom, and apparently memorized every medication dosage more accurately than the nursing staff. "You're hovering," Amber informed him one afternoon while attempting to open a water bottle one-handed from the couch. Benedict appeared beside her instantly and twisted the cap off before she finished the sentence. "Incorrect," he replied calmly. "I'm preventing preventable suffering. That's just hovering with expensive vocabulary." He handed the bottle over without shame. "Drink your water." Theo visited regularly and found the situation endlessly entertaining. During one particularly dramatic physical therapy session where Amber threatened to murder her rehabilitation specialist with a resistance band, Theo leaned against the doorway eating grapes while Benedict paced nearby like an anxious husband from a 19th-century war novel. "You know," Theo remarked casually, "most people survive shoulder rehab without corporate-level supervision." Benedict did not even look at him. "She nearly tore stitches yesterday trying to carry groceries." Amber crossed her arms defensively. "They were light groceries." "You attempted watermelon." "One watermelon." Benedict turned toward Theo with visible outrage. "She said that like it improves the situation." Theo burst out laughing, while Amber threw a pillow at both of them. Yet beneath the teasing, something deeper kept unfolding quietly between Amber and Benedict during those weeks. Without constant corporate emergencies pulling him away, Amber finally saw how profoundly Benedict organized his entire emotional world around caring for the people he loved. Not performatively. Not strategically. Instinctively. He remembered exact times her pain worsened during the evenings and adjusted schedules around it without discussion. He learned how to braid her hair badly but determinedly when shoulder movement became difficult. He sat beside her during restless nights when lingering concussion headaches made sleep impossible, reading aloud from random history books because his voice calmed her enough to drift off eventually. One sleepless night around 3 in the morning, Amber woke to find Benedict asleep awkwardly in the chair beside her bed, still wearing half-buttoned work clothes and reading glasses slipping crookedly down his nose. His laptop remained open beside him, displaying financial projections abandoned mid-sentence. Amber stared quietly for a long moment, overwhelmed by tenderness so sharp it almost hurt. Carefully, she reached out with her good arm and brushed hair back from his forehead. Benedict woke instantly because apparently years of corporate warfare had conditioned him into sleeping like a paranoid wolf. The moment he realized it was her, his entire expression softened. "You okay?" he asked immediately, voice rough with sleep. Amber smiled faintly. "You fell asleep sitting up again." He blinked slowly, glanced at the laptop, then looked mildly betrayed by reality itself. "I was answering one email." "Sure." Benedict stood and stretched stiffly. "Pain level?" "Manageable." He narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "That answer usually means you're understating things. Look at you developing emotional intelligence." He ignored that and crouched beside the bed instead, touching her wrist lightly. "Headache?" "A little." Without another word, Benedict disappeared briefly and returned carrying medication and tea already prepared. Amber accepted both while watching him carefully. "You know," she said quietly, "you don't always have to take care of everything." Benedict sat beside her on the mattress edge. "I know. Do you?" He considered honestly before answering. "Not naturally." Amber set the tea aside and touched his face gently. "You're allowed to rest too." Something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. "When you were unconscious after surgery," he said quietly, "the doctor told me I should go home for a few hours." Amber listened silently. Benedict looked away toward the dark windows. "And I realized I physically couldn't." His voice carried quiet embarrassment now, as though the admission itself exposed weakness. "The idea of being somewhere you weren't felt unbearable." Amber's chest tightened painfully. Benedict laughed once under his breath. "Not psychologically healthy, I assume." "No," Amber whispered softly. "Just human." He looked back toward her then with the same vulnerable intensity that still occasionally caught her off guard because Benedict never did anything halfway, not even love. She pulled him closer gently until his forehead rested against hers. "Come here," she murmured. For several quiet minutes neither spoke. The city glowed beyond the windows while distant rain tapped softly against the glass again, almost becoming part of the rhythm of their lives now. Eventually Benedict sighed against her hair. "You realize this injury has made you unbearable." Amber smiled sleepily. "Explain." "You keep looking at me like I'm emotionally redeemable." She laughed softly. "Too late. I'm committed now." As Amber regained strength over the following month, wedding plans resumed cautiously. Evelyn immediately attempted reclaiming organizational control the moment Amber could hold a pen again, which led to a spectacular argument over floral arrangements that ended with Benedict physically removing both women from a conference room before casualties occurred. "You're both terrifying," he informed them while steering them toward separate elevators. Evelyn looked deeply offended. "I'm trying to create elegance." Amber crossed her arms. "You tried to order 6,000 imported orchids. Because local arrangements lacked emotional sophistication." Benedict closed his eyes briefly. "I miss corporate corruption investigations. They were simpler." Despite the chaos, excitement gradually replaced tension surrounding the wedding. It no longer felt like a transaction looming over them. It felt like a beginning they had chosen together after nearly destroying themselves avoiding it the first time. One evening while reviewing final venue preparations at the coastline estate, Amber wandered down toward the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The same waters where storms once mirrored everything fractured between them now rolled calm beneath late sunset light. Benedict found her there eventually, coat slung over one shoulder while wind moved through his hair. "Lydia's threatening to resign over seating charts," he informed her. Amber smiled without looking away from the horizon. Again? Apparently your aunt refuses to sit near my cousin because of cryptocurrency opinions. Amber laughed quietly. Benedict stepped beside her and followed her gaze toward the sea. For a while they simply listened to waves breaking against rock below. Then Amber asked softly, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this?" Benedict's expression shifted immediately because he knew exactly what she meant. The divorce. The silence. The years spent misunderstanding each other so completely they nearly walked away permanently. Every day, he admitted. Amber glanced toward him carefully. "Does that scare you?" "Not anymore." He reached for her hand slowly. "Now it reminds me never to waste time pretending." She leaned lightly against his shoulder while wind swept around them. "I used to think love was supposed to feel safe immediately," she confessed after a moment. "But with us," Benedict smiled faintly. "It felt like emotional warfare?" "Exactly." He laughed softly under his breath. Amber continued more thoughtfully, "Now I think maybe real love isn't safety at first. Maybe it's choosing someone enough times that eventually fear stops being louder than trust." Benedict looked down at her with unmistakable affection. "You realize that sounded alarmingly wise." Recovery made me philosophical. Terrible side effect. He kissed the top of her head gently while sunset light spread gold across the water below them. Then his phone rang. Amber groaned dramatically. "If that's another wedding crisis, I'm throwing us both into the ocean." Benedict checked the screen and frowned slightly. "It's Arthur." He answered cautiously. "What happened?" A pause. Benedict's expression shifted toward confusion. "Now." Another silence. "Fine. We'll come." He hung up slowly. Amber raised an eyebrow. That sounded ominous. "My father wants us at the estate tonight." "Why?" Benedict looked genuinely perplexed. "He says he has something important to discuss before the wedding." By the time they arrived at the Ashford estate, full darkness had settled across the grounds. Arthur waited in the library alone beside a lit fireplace looking unusually tense. Several thick folders sat spread across the desk before him. Evelyn sat nearby holding wine with the exhausted patience of someone who already survived one dramatic conversation tonight and was prepared for another. "You sounded mysterious," Benedict said carefully while Amber sat beside Evelyn. Arthur removed his glasses slowly. "I'm retiring." Silence crashed through the room instantly. Benedict stared at him. "Retiring from what?" Arthur looked deeply unimpressed. "Everything, ideally." Evelyn nearly smiled into her wineglass. Benedict remained frozen. "You hate retirement." "Correct. You once described golf as organized spiritual decay." "Still accurate." Arthur folded his hands together. "But I spent 40 years building a life entirely around control." His gaze moved briefly toward Evelyn. "Turns out mortality adjusts perspective." Benedict said nothing, clearly trying to process hearing emotional self-awareness emerge from his father repeatedly like some ongoing medical anomaly. Arthur continued more quietly now. "I watched you nearly lose Amber because you thought responsibility mattered more than honesty. Then, after a pause, and I realized you learned that from me." The room remained completely silent except for fire crackling softly nearby. Arthur pushed one folder across the desk toward Benedict. "Succession documents are finalized." Benedict looked down at the papers but did not touch them immediately. "You're serious?" "Unfortunately." Arthur leaned back heavily. "The company needs someone capable of building something healthier than what I handed you." Benedict's expression tightened with emotion he clearly had no idea how to navigate. "Why now?" Arthur looked toward the fire. "Because I don't want my last meaningful conversation with my son to happen from a hospital bed." The honesty in the statement hit hard enough that even Evelyn looked momentarily shaken. Benedict stared at his father for several long seconds before quietly asking, "What if I fail?" Arthur's answer came without hesitation. "You will." Benedict blinked, startled. Arthur continued calmly, "Everyone does eventually." Then, more softly, "But you'll fail trying to protect people instead of controlling them." His eyes met Benedict's directly. "That makes you a better man than I was at your age." Amber watched the words land inside Benedict like something both painful and healing simultaneously. For so many years he had carried his father's approval like an impossible unfinished sentence. Hearing it offered now did not erase the damage between them, but it shifted something fundamental nonetheless. Benedict finally sat slowly across from Arthur, still visibly overwhelmed. "You really trust me with all of this?" Arthur gave a dry laugh. "God help us, yes." Evelyn looked toward Amber then and murmured quietly, "I never thought I'd live long enough to see these two communicate without emotional bloodshed." Amber smiled faintly. "Growth. Terrifying concept," Evelyn agreed. The rest of the evening unfolded strangely softly after that. Not perfect. Not magically healed. But honest in ways the Ashford family had avoided for decades. Arthur shared stories from Benedict's childhood Amber had never heard before, including one horrifying incident involving a 12-year-old Benedict attempting to negotiate labor conditions for prep school kitchen staff after discovering unfair overtime schedules. "You unionized cafeteria workers at 12? Amber asked in disbelief. Benedict looked vaguely defensive. "Their treatment was exploitative." Arthur actually laughed openly then, deep and genuine enough to surprise everyone in the room. He threatened to contact newspapers. "Did it work?" Amber asked. "Terrifyingly well," Arthur admitted. Later, while driving home beneath clear night skies finally free of rain, Benedict remained unusually quiet beside her. Amber rested her hand over his. "You okay?" He looked out the window thoughtfully. "I spent most of my life believing my father saw me as inadequate." Amber squeezed his fingers lightly. "And now?" Benedict exhaled slowly. "Now I think he was just afraid I'd become kinder than him." She studied him carefully. "You say that like it's a burden." "Sometimes it is." He turned toward her then, expression softer. "But you make it easier." Amber leaned across the console and kissed him gently. "Good." Benedict smiled faintly against her mouth. "You know," he murmured afterward, "for someone who once wanted emotional distance, you've become alarmingly essential to my continued functioning." "Sounds serious." "Critically." And as city lights stretched ahead toward the life waiting for them, neither of them noticed that for the first time since the arranged marriage began, the future no longer felt like something to survive. It finally felt like home. The wedding week arrived with astonishing speed, bringing with it a level of public fascination that bordered on national instability. Every entertainment network, business journal, and gossip site seemed determined to treat the event as a cultural resurrection story instead of two exhausted people finally deciding to stop emotionally torturing themselves. Benedict handled the media attention with practiced indifference. Amber handled it by threatening to fake her own disappearance twice before Tuesday. "There are drones outside the florist," she informed Benedict one morning while glaring through the penthouse windows at distant paparazzi. Benedict looked up from financial reports without concern. "That feels excessive. One of them tried interviewing my mother about floral symbolism." "Did she answer?" Amber crossed her arms. "She gave them a 40-minute lecture on peonies." Benedict slowly lowered the report. "Your mother frightens me sometimes." Correct response. Despite the chaos surrounding them, an undercurrent of quiet anticipation followed Benedict everywhere that week. Amber noticed it most during unguarded moments. The way he paused occasionally while looking at her, as if mentally confirming this was all still real. The way his hand automatically sought hers during crowded meetings. The way he smiled now, more openly than she remembered from any period before the divorce. Even Lydia finally cornered Amber during a venue walkthrough and said, "I don't know what emotional witchcraft you performed on that man, but he voluntarily left the office at 6 yesterday." Amber blinked. "That early?" Exactly. Lydia looked faintly traumatized. People applauded. 2 nights before the ceremony they hosted a small private dinner at the coastal estate for close family and longtime friends. The atmosphere felt strangely intimate compared to the massive social obligations that had surrounded their first marriage. No performative networking. No strategic alliances disguised as toasts. Just people who genuinely cared about them gathered beneath warm lights overlooking the ocean. Theo immediately abused this emotional environment by giving a speech that began sincerely and devolved into public humiliation within minutes. When Amber first married Benedict, he announced while holding champagne with dangerous confidence, "I honestly assumed one of them would eventually bury the other in international waters." Amber buried her face in her hands while guests erupted laughing. Benedict looked almost offended. "That feels unnecessarily pessimistic." Theo pointed directly at him. "You stared at my sister during family dinners like a man suffering from elegant Victorian heartbreak." More laughter. Theo continued mercilessly, "Meanwhile Amber spent 3 years insisting she felt emotionally neutral about the billionaire who looked at her like sunlight personally signed his paychecks." "Theo," Amber warned. "I'm not finished." He raised his glass proudly. Anyway, against all odds and several catastrophic communication failures, these two somehow figured out they were in love. Benedict leaned toward Amber and muttered under his breath, "I'm revoking his invitation." Yet Amber could feel warmth radiating from him despite the embarrassment. Later that evening while guests drifted between terraces and candlelit gardens, Benedict slipped away briefly toward the cliffs overlooking the water. Amber found him there eventually standing alone beneath the stars. "Hiding?" she asked softly while approaching. Benedict glanced back toward the glowing estate behind them. "Recovering from your brother's speech." She laughed quietly and stepped beside him. Waves crashed far below against dark rock while wind moved gently through the coastal grass. Benedict looked out toward the ocean for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you remember the first time we came here together?" Amber nodded slowly. It had been during the early months of their arranged marriage. The estate was still unfamiliar then, Benedict himself even more so. They spent most of that trip circling each other politely, both too guarded to say anything real. "I was terrified of you," Amber admitted unexpectedly. Benedict looked startled. "Terrified?" "You were impossible to read." She smiled faintly. "And annoyingly attractive. A devastating combination." Amber nudged his shoulder lightly. "You acted like emotions were embarrassing design flaws." Benedict's expression softened with rueful understanding. "At the time I thought they were." She studied him quietly beneath the stars. "What changed?" He answered without hesitation. "Loving you long enough became more painful than being honest." The simple truth of that settled between them gently. Amber slipped her hand into his coat pocket to warm cold fingers. Benedict immediately wrapped his arm around her waist. "You know," he murmured, "I used to stand out here during our marriage imagining impossible conversations." "Like what?" He smiled faintly. "Mostly versions where you kissed me voluntarily instead of out of contractual politeness." Amber burst out laughing. "That's deeply tragic." "I know. You could have just talked to me." Benedict looked genuinely horrified by the concept. Direct emotional communication? Absolutely not. She kissed him softly before he could continue. Benedict relaxed instantly against her, warmth and familiarity settling naturally between them now in ways neither had believed possible once. After a while Amber rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath layers of expensive wool. "Nervous about tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Benedict considered carefully. "Not about marrying you." That's a suspiciously specific answer. He exhaled softly into the night air. "I think part of me still expects happiness to disappear if I stop preparing for disaster." Amber lifted her head slightly to look at him. "You don't have to earn this anymore." Benedict's gaze moved over her face with quiet intensity. "I know that here." He touched his chest lightly. I'm still teaching the rest of myself to believe it. Something about the vulnerability in his voice tightened her chest painfully with love. She pulled him down into another kiss, slower this time, patient and certain. We'll practice, she whispered afterward. Benedict smiled against her forehead. That sounds dangerously permanent. Good. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear for the first time in weeks, sunlight spilling across the coastline as though even the weather had finally decided these two people suffered enough. Amber woke early inside the estate surrounded by flowers, garment bags, and several aggressively emotional women attempting not to cry before noon. Her mother burst into tears immediately upon seeing the dress. Evelyn managed approximately 12 minutes of composure before breaking as well. This is absurd, she muttered while dabbing at her eyes angrily. We survived corporate scandals with more dignity. Amber laughed softly while standing before the mirror in the finished gown. Unlike the elaborate spectacle of her first wedding dress, this one felt entirely like her. Elegant but unpretentious. Graceful without trying to impress anyone except the man waiting downstairs. For a brief moment while everyone bustled around her, Amber looked at her own reflection quietly and remembered the woman who signed that first marriage contract years ago. Defensive. Lonely. Determined never to need too much from anyone. She barely recognized that version of herself now. Not because love changed her into someone else, but because loving Benedict honestly had finally allowed her to stop surviving and start living. Downstairs, Benedict stood with Theo near the ocean-facing ceremony platform while guests filled white chairs beneath drifting sea wind. He wore dark formal tailoring with infuriating perfection, but Theo could still see tension buried beneath the calm exterior. You look like you're preparing for combat, Theo informed him. Benedict adjusted his cuffs. Large ceremonies increase statistical probability of catastrophe. You run multinational negotiations. None involve emotional vows in front of my entire family. Theo laughed. You're really in love with her, huh? Benedict looked toward the empty aisle instinctively. Hopelessly. The answer came so quietly and honestly that Theo's teasing expression softened immediately. Good, he said after a moment. Take care of her. Benedict met his eyes directly. Always. Music drifted softly across the gardens as guests settled into silence. Then the ceremony began. Benedict had prepared himself mentally for almost every possibility except the reality of seeing Amber walk toward him beneath open sky and sunlight. The moment she appeared at the end of the aisle, everything else disappeared. Noise vanished. Movement stopped. For several stunned seconds he could only stare. Amber moved slowly through rows of guests glowing gold beneath coastal light, and Benedict felt something inside him unravel completely because after everything that happened between them, after years of longing and fear and near loss, she was still choosing him. Voluntarily. Publicly. Joyfully. Theo leaned closer and whispered, "You're crying." Benedict did not even bother denying it. By the time Amber reached him, his composure was hanging together by threads. She smiled softly upon seeing his expression. "Hey," she whispered. Benedict let out one disbelieving breath. "You're here." Her face warmed instantly because only Benedict could make that sound like a miracle instead of an observation. The ceremony itself remained simple compared to the scale people expected from the Ashford name. No theatrical excess. No political guest lists. Just vows spoken honestly before the ocean where storms once nearly mirrored the worst parts of them. When it came time for Benedict's vows, he looked at Amber for several seconds before speaking, clearly abandoning whatever carefully prepared speech existed originally. "I spent years believing loving you quietly was safer than telling the truth," he said, voice steady despite visible emotion. "But silence nearly cost me the best thing that ever happened to my life." Amber felt tears rise instantly. Benedict continued more softly now. "You taught me that love isn't weakness. It's trust. It's choosing someone fully even when fear would be easier." His eyes never left hers. "So I promise you this, no more pretending. No more distance disguised as protection." His voice roughened slightly at the edges. Wherever life goes next, I'll meet it honestly with you. Half the guests were openly crying now, including Arthur, who looked deeply offended by his own emotions. When Amber spoke her vows, her voice trembled only once at the beginning. The first time we married, I thought our story was temporary. She smiled faintly through gathering tears. I thought love belonged to other people, people braver or simpler than us. Benedict's expression softened with painful tenderness. Amber squeezed his hands lightly. But somehow, through every mistake and misunderstanding, you kept loving me patiently enough for me to learn how to love you back. She laughed softly through tears. Which still feels slightly unfair considering how stubborn we both are. Quiet laughter rippled through the crowd. Then Amber looked directly into his eyes. You are my safest place now. Benedict's breath caught visibly. And I promise that no matter what happens next, I will never run from us again. By the time they exchanged rings again, neither of them could stop smiling long enough to pretend composure mattered anymore. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife once more, Benedict kissed her like someone still astonished by his own luck, while ocean wine swept around them and guests erupted into applause. At the reception afterward, music and laughter filled the coastal gardens deep into the evening. Arthur danced exactly once with Evelyn before declaring public affection exhausting. Theo got mildly drunk and attempted teaching senior executives terrible dance moves. Lydia threatened bodily harm against 2 reporters who tried sneaking onto private property. Through all of it, Benedict kept finding reasons to touch Amber somehow, like reassurance disguised as instinct. A hand against her back while walking